Perfect love casts out fear. That's from 1 John chapter 4, verse 18. It's one of those letters that the apostle wrote towards the end of his life, and it helps us get to this idea of what churches are doing in the U.S. and specifically what they're doing here in Michigan. There's a lot of opinions from both sides about what churches should and shouldn't be doing, and I want to address what I'm doing and what many of my friends that are pastors are doing and what's driving us to make these decisions. Um, this is partially opinion, but this is also a core idea of what it means to be a Christian and of what motivates Christians to do what they do, or at least what should motivate them. I'm going to whip up my Bible here really quick. I'm going to read to you from 1 John chapter 4. This is starting in verse 11. I'm going to read to you all the way to verse 19. This is the Apostle John speaking to this church here that's really needing some guidance as to what their motives are. It says here in verse 11, "Dear friends, if God so loved us, then we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God at any time. And if we love one another, then God resides in us, and his love is perfected in us. By this we know that we reside in God and he in us, and that he has given us of his Spirit. And we have seen and testify that the Father has sent the Son to be the Savior of the world." Apostle John here is mentioning the gospel message. And then he repeats this idea again. If anyone confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God resides in him and he in God. And we have come to know and to believe the love that God has in us. God is love. The one who resides in love resides in God, and God resides in him. By this, love is perfected with us, so that we may have confidence in the day of judgment, because just as Jesus is, so also we are in the world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears punishment hasn't been perfected in love. We love because he loved us first. What does all that say? Well, there's some disconnect for a lot of Christians as to why we do what we do, why we gather, why we want to gather. Here's the thing, folks. In this passage, John is explaining to the church what should inspire Christians to make disciples. Discipleship is this process of really being conditioned to think a certain way, to value certain things, and to be a follower of Christ. It's the main purpose of the church, and that's to make disciples. When it's talking about love here in this passage, it isn't just that Christians are nice. That is part of it. But it's also why we gather and why we're making disciples. So when we discuss really as a church why we're meeting, why we're not meeting, one of the primary factors should be making disciples. If we're not making disciples, we really have no reason to meet. And making disciples is an incredibly difficult process. It is really, you're cultivating a love for Jesus in people that wouldn't love Jesus otherwise. We're not saving people. We're not getting people to heaven. We're cultivating a deeper love for Jesus in people. And hopefully that love will lead them to be obedient and to also make disciples themselves. It has a really kind of a chain reaction where we're expecting the whole area to become followers of Christ by how we live and by what motivates us. Gary Burge, who's a Bible scholar, has a little ditty on this that I'd like to read to you here. And it's explaining really what John's trying to get at in this letter to this church. Finally, the Apostle John offers a third source of inspiration as to what Christian love does. We don't simply hear about what God has done or the gospel, nor do we simply experience the Spirit, the result of the gospel working in us. John insists that through our proclamation, through our testimony, through the way we live, the reality of God presses itself into our lives. We are forced to observe that faithful, loving discipleship isn't simply an emotional experience of being loved or a response to an ethical command. It's not even loving conduct, although all of these things are significant and part of it. Such discipleship instead has theological content. that means is our motivation to love, our motivation to meet, our motivation to be the church, our motivation to get together on Sundays, all comes from our view of what God's like, the theological content of our discipleship. And what that should do is that should drive and motivate us as Christians to pick the loving options, the options that cultivate a love for Christ in people around us who wouldn't love Christ otherwise. Cornerstone isn't meeting in person yet because we feel like at this point, from what we know, the loving decision would be to hold off meeting. Not to hold off making disciples, not to hold off being obedient to the Lord, not to hold off in our own personal lives of developing a theological view of God for what we do. If you want to know more about this, I'd love to talk to you about it. If you're a Christian and you are struggling with being discontent or bitter or angry as to certain decisions that are being made, know this. If you're making disciples, if you're cultivating a love for Christ and other people and in yourself, then you're doing what you're supposed to. I hope that calms any anxiety, and I hope that leads you to be the church. With that, take care and God bless.